Now that we've looked at the new globalized economy, it's time to look at the issues with it as well as some of the pushback that's gone along with this globalization. Growing disparities have really become a source of conflict between the richer global north and the developing global south. The east and west division of capitalism and communism really is beginning to fade. So the developed north and developing south became the source of the new divide. Tension over trade rules and terms of foreign aid grew. Now, for example, a large group of developing countries banded together in the 1970s to create a new international economic order, really without much success. And recently, developing countries have resisted restrictions on their agricultural goods by seeking to protect their own farmers. Growing disparities between developing countries make collective action more difficult. The oil-rich nations of the Middle East had little in common with the banana-producing countries of Central America. And the developing states in China, India, and South Korea likewise had little in common with developing African countries. Growing economic inequality within individual states, both rich and poor, is something that is needing to be addressed. The United States lost millions of manufacturing jobs due to a shift in the division of labor and the outsourcing of traditional factory jobs to Asia or Latin America for lower costs, forcing factory workers into lower paying jobs. And others subsequently prospered in high-tech industries. Even some skilled work, like computer programming, was outsourced to India, Ireland, and Russia. Northern Mexico, with its links to the US, became much more prosperous than southern Mexico. In China, urban income by 2000 was 3 times that of rural income. So with this inequity, there's also resistance to globalization, and growing popular movements against it emerged in the 1990s. And this resistance involves people from both rich and poor countries alike, and attracts a coalition of trade unions, environmental activists, scholars and students, and political activists. An anti-free trade movement sprung up in Mexico in 1994 and claimed that globalization was a process to eliminate that multitude of people who are not useful to the powerful. Protesters like these argue that free trade, market-driven corporate globalization lowered labor standards, encouraged ecological destruction, ignored human rights and local cultures, and enhanced global inequality. They attracted global attention with a massive protest at the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle in 1999. The WTO represents 149 nations and negotiates the rules for global commerce and free trade. So it became a major target for globalization critics. Tens of thousands of protesters descended on the city in a much publicized protest, and subsequent meetings were met with similar results. In 2001, alternative globalization activists created the World Social Forum to coordinate strategy and share experiences in an effort to demonstrate that neoliberal globalization was not an inevitable process. Now, for many, opposition to corporate free trade globalization is one and the same with opposition to growing U.S. power and influence in the world. Often seen as an American empire, most Americans deny that America today is an empire because they want to distinguish themselves from that of the British or the French in the 19th century. And the United States is best described as an informal empire, like those exercised by Europeans in China and the Middle East in the 19th century. Because in both instances, states used economics, they used political pressure, and periodic military action to help create governments and societies compatible with their interests. Some scholars have emphasized the American use of force, while others have focused on the attractiveness of American culture and the willingness of many to voluntarily follow the lead of the U.S. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War left the US without any equivalent power in opposition. The US was able to act unilaterally against Afghanistan and Iraq after being attacked on 9/11 without the fear of triggering another crisis. Establishment of a lasting peace is more elusive, even though both regimes were quickly toppled. And the US does find itself in a new global struggle to contain or eliminate Islamic terrorism. The US has also faced growing international economic competition since the 1980s. The US share of overall world production went from 50% in 1945 down to 20% in the 80s. And, this is a sharp reversal of the US trade balance when you realize that US imports now far exceed its exports. And China actually overtook the US as the world's largest economy in 2014. Now, armed struggle against US intervention in Vietnam, Cuba, and Iraq also marks some of the issues regarding these policies. During the Cold War, some states like Egypt, India, or Ethiopia turned to the USSR to limit US influence or play the two off against each other. France even withdrew from NATO in 1967 and expelled all foreign troops from the country. There's an intense dislike even of American cultural imperialism. By 2000, widespread opposition to US international policies is imminent. Russia opposed Western desires to bring former Soviet territories into NATO, and thus pressured Ukraine to stay allied with Russia, and they seized the Crimea in 2014. Others have criticized the international policies of the US, including its refusal to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, the refusal to sign off on the Kyoto Protocol, its doctrine of preemptive war, and the alleged use of torture. Now, the global exercise of American power has also caused controversy within the US itself. The Vietnam War split the country worse than any conflict since the Civil War. The US invasion of Iraq provoked similar protests and controversies as Americans equated themselves with an imperial power and sought to reverse these trends. So economic globalization is not something that's always viewed favorably.